All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce our final solo alumni speaker, Ben Linville-Engler. Ben is the Chief Investment Strategist and Program Executive and the Director of the Massachusetts eHealth Institute at the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative. MasTech is a public agency that supports business formation and growth in the state's technology sector, helping Massachusetts lead in the global digital economy. Before this role, Ben served as the Industry and Certificate Co-Director for the SDM program. He's also served in vice president roles in technology, product development, and engineering at Applied Medical. Ben will be speaking today about his work on the COVID-19 pandemic, combining regional and national public and private innovation, and working on the Massachusetts Manufacturing Emergency Response Team, or MAMERT. His efforts were recognized as the recipient of MIT's 2021 Collier Medal for dedication to community and innovation. In addition to holding an MIT master's degree in engineering and management, Ben holds a BS in mechanical engineering from the University of Colorado at Boulder.
Thanks, Sam. So I'm going to carry this around because I have to try to explain what all of those titles and acronyms and all of that were that were just read. But as Naomi mentioned, my name is Ben Linville-Engler. I have been a part of the SDM community, I'd say technically since 2016, but I would argue since 1985 when I was born. As the industry co-director, I had the privilege of actually being part of the committee that reviewed applicants coming into SDM. And one of the things that I recognized, my experience when you find SDM, when you're looking for something, it's not so much that it's basically you're finding your new home, right? It's something that you kind of felt like you thought that way. Maybe you just didn't have the vocabulary or knew what it was called. So I think this is a really special place. And so I'm going to try to highlight some of my experience through that and some of the opportunities that I've been given just in the short 5-6 years since actually joining the community. So real quick, the current role that I have, and to the two questions that came from the last session. One, how do you continue as an alumni to take advantage of new coursework? One, come work for SDM, because then you get to be involved in all of it as the classes continue. Two, how do you translate some of these great things that we learn to nonprofits, state government? Go work for a nonprofit state government. So I am currently technically an employee of the Massachusetts state government, the executive branch. I'm the Chief Investment Officer for the MasTech Collaborative. We focus on strengthening the technology and innovation economy in Massachusetts. It's a pretty broad scope. Right now we have 5 divisions that we're focused on. I have responsibility for 3. The eHealth Institute's Health Information Exchange and eHealth with hospital systems, as well as digital health innovation. The Mass Cyber Center, so Stephen and I are going to connect after this. I forgot to mention, I'm going to play SDM bingo as we go through this because I feel like I'm going to have a callback to about every single presenter that we've had thus far. And then also for the Center for Advanced Manufacturing. And then my other kind of bucket with the investment side is looking holistically across what we do. And I'll have a slide at the very end to try to explain this if we have time. If not, happy to connect with those of you that do live and work in the state or are interested in moving back to the state, because that's part of my job as well. Couple quotes that I think resonate with a lot of the other presenters today. Steve Jobs, for me, it's not so much who said it, it's what they said. And I wholly agree that creativity is really just connecting things. And for me personally, a lot of that has to do with the experiences that I've had or the people that I'm going through those experiences with. Some really interesting things can emerge from that. The second one, again, not so much who said it, but what was said. I don't want to strike a balance. I'm looking to strike harmony. And so for me, time is always dynamic, right? Nothing's really ever balanced, maybe for a split second or a moment, but how do things harmonize over time? And hopefully these things kind of get carried through as we go through this presentation. So to go back a long ways, in 1985, I was born in Holcomb, Kansas, which I found out a few years ago is the 8th most remote town in the United States. 4 hours to Wichita to get to a mall. My wife's from Orange County, California. There's 4 malls within 4 minutes of where she grew up. Big John Deere family. So if anybody was with John Deere in the room, this was a great part of being the certificate co-director and working with John Deere was I grew up driving tractors, working on the farm, seeing technology integrated into the 8th most remote town in the world, or in the US, not the world. So I did leave the farm. I went to University of Colorado, undergrad in mechanical engineering and biomedical engineering with an emphasis in biochemistry. So Ollie, if he's still here, when you want to talk life sciences, I have some thoughts. But then I went to work for Applied Medical, which I was mechanical engineer, trained a little bit in design, and this company offered an opportunity to design surgical devices. But they were also incredibly vertically integrated. And I had a big interest in understanding the life cycle process. I maybe didn't think of it in those terms at the time, but that big E, engineering and design, the big M, manufacturing. So the little teal flags there represent 20 different buildings in Orange County, California, Rancho Santa Margarita, not a cheap place for real estate, but a big manufacturing footprint. We're going to design the components, we're going to design the injection molding tooling, we're going to build the tooling, we're going to actually run the components there, and that whole process. And then I had a chance to go build out engineering, manufacturing in our Netherlands facilities, which was a sales and distribution organization abroad. So I left Applied Medical as a VP of product development and engineering and came to SDM, understandably with a lot of baggage. Some of that had to do with the types of systems that we built. We shifted from mechanical to embedded electrical systems. So part of my professional career was looking at how do you actually build out embedded systems engineering, software development in our integrated organization. So there's the product system, instruments, disposable components, and other things. And then there was the organizational system. And this, for someone who'd been in industry for 4 years and got asked, can you build out this embedded systems division? I had a beard at that time. I haven't shaved since. I'm pretty sure they didn't know how old that I was, but really quickly got into understanding, one, the importance of, but two, the complexity of the product system, the organization system, and all the different tools and enterprise things that you can do to integrate that. Layered in, as Lisa would attest to, regulatory quality management challenges with the FDA. One of the things that I learned through all of these experiences is no matter where you're at, right, and some of what was talked about is, what are we doing? Where are we going? What are we going to do when we get there? I think to me, it's who are we doing it with? Who are we going there with? And who are we going to meet when we get there? And I found that you meet really great people everywhere. These are some of my alumni from 2016 class of SDM in our first week. My nieces were kind enough to send me a frozen lunchbox for my first day back at school. So my focus while I was here was pretty broad. I think you're going to get a sense of that. I have a lot of curiosities, and this was a great opportunity to scratch a lot of those. But SDM was a really great place for me to call home while I was here. But dabbled in, and I think if Brian were to pull up my course records, it's a bit of a shotgun scattering of things, but I made it through. But innovation, entrepreneurship, a lot of leadership, broadening out from minimally invasive surgical devices to product development, digital health, and life sciences. I did my thesis with the Broad Institute, the group that ultimately did a lot of the COVID testing, which I'll get into. And I'm going to have to go a lot faster. But I came out of this, if you guys have seen the Lego movie, I have a 3-year-old at home. This was me, right? You're sort of thrown into this hyperspace tunnel from SDM. You're shot back out into industry, right? You've got your new bag of tools. And I don't know if we have audio right now, but basically you're kind of in this your new way of thinking, right? You're seeing the world in a different way, and ultimately come out the end. And I felt quite confident as I was, quote, like this master builder, right? You're now this systems thinker, systems engineer. You go back maybe into the corporate world and you're attacked by all these micromanagers. It's a really great metaphor. And so for me, I had the great fortune then of coming back right out of graduating to work with Joan and the team here. I can tell you, Joan is not a micromanager, which is really great, as the certificate co-director. And I'm not going to talk about that role, but I think I got a lot of really great exposure and continued to kind of learn from the team here during that experience. But a lot of this came to a head. I started a short course in IAP. There's reasons, and I won't go into the background of this, of sort of the gap in medical device, digital health entrepreneurship as it relates to those later stage FDA quality things. The important thing with this slide is that this was January 2020. And so I'd put together sort of this compendium of my industry experience, a lot of things that I learned at SDM, ran a short course or seminar during IAP. We had about 50 students that came, and then COVID hit. And I exercised basically this on repeat for a year and a half, which we're going to talk a little bit about. Stakeholders are really important. This course was called Architecting Trust. Trust in the medical device industry is quite distributed between your company, but then supply chains, certified bodies, FDA regulators, providers, surgical staff in this case, and the patient is sort of a second order removed. This is part of what we went through in the course and understanding all those relationships. And when COVID hit, I kind of serendipitously ended up on a Zoom call with about 50 individuals through some other connections in course 2, John Hart, for this manufacturing emergency response team that the state was asking manufacturers to participate in. The first meeting was on March 20th. I stopped updating this slide as the pandemic has progressed, because every time I have to go back to the data, it gets a little depressing. But we were really looking at how do we help, one, support the local community and our health system providers as they're trying to understand and respond to this. So it's better to hear sort of that first day experience, not from me, but the chief of medicine from Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Oh, wrong button. I don't know if it'll play on its own.
There were two nightmares. One was we wouldn't have enough ventilators. I'm the physician in chief here, and my patients would die. That was the first problem. Emergency number two is that we wouldn't have enough of this stuff because we were in short supply and we were running through it really quickly. And so I would be sending my people in to situations where they were going to get infected.
The number of reported cases, as everybody knows, has seen a significant uptick in the United States and in Massachusetts. State health officials are closely monitoring and tracing presumptive positive cases.
So as this cascading crisis happened, our phone just started ringing off the hook.
So I'll jump ahead just real quick. One of the comments that comes there is sort of the federal response to PPE. And it became very clear at that time, the states were kind of on their own. Massachusetts was starting to lose orders that were getting seized and sometimes by the federal government and others. And so one of the concepts was, well, if we make it here, we can keep it here. Through Mass Tech and that Center for Advanced Manufacturing, there's a large industry consortium that they called on to say, what can we do? And that was that first meeting with 50 individuals. COVID created a really clear mission, but it had a lot of different vocabularies. And this is actually from Paul Carlisle, who I believe was also involved with SDM early on. This is from my thesis work, but really understanding translation between different types of individuals. So on the left, we have a physician. On the right, we have an engineer. What we were seeing in Massachusetts was every physician was reaching out to anybody they knew as an engineer, didn't know if they were software engineer, biomedical engineer, mechanical, electrical, but just asking them to make them something. On the other side, all the engineers were reaching out and saying, I talked to a physician. They said they need XYZ. Well, they don't know if they're a dermatologist, an ophthalmologist, the chief of medicine from Beth Israel. And so there was just a lot of noise, right? We have a huge network of healthcare individuals in the state. The top two employers are Mass General Brigham and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And we have a lot of technical talent. And all of a sudden, these two networks were just colliding. And understandably so, we were in a crisis. So part of what we were looking at in bringing this group together, somewhat of creating a center of gravity where we could all come together. At this point, I think it was 3 times a week to figure out what we needed, how are we going to make it, how can we test it. The FDA at that time was rapidly changing emergency documentation to help support rapid expansion of production. I was either reading FDA documents or kids' picture books. And so there may be some slides in here where those sort of collide a little bit. But it was very much a multi-stakeholder type of approach. And I had a lot of expertise from my past industry experience. I had just gone through that course. So one of the things that I had figured out was you can look up how you get an N95 respirator approved through the FDA. I figured out who at the FDA most recently signed off on one of those, gave them a call, got connected to the director of all hazards response at the FDA, and they became basically part of our team. I was the liaison to the FDA during this crisis. Very watered down version of our process, but really looking at reducing uncertainties all in parallel in terms of needs and demand, types of external factors like regulatory, those other federal pressures that we were seeing, capacity and capability of all these manufacturers that were raising their hand saying we can do X, Y, Z, starting to get some dollars flowing from the state. And then ultimately we helped over 50 companies pivot their operations to produce PPE that was compliant with the FDA. Love Pop makes greeting cards, right? They started becoming one of the largest gown manufacturers in May of 2020 through their Vietnam facilities. New Balance was some of the first masks to the state to help their maintenance employees so that they can keep infrastructure running. I'm just going to click through the end of this one, but this gives you a sense of the breadth of what we were doing. Isolation gowns, naropharyngeal swabs, N95 masks, hand sanitizer. We did some work with ventilators, but is anyone here from Bloom Energy? I know we did a tech check to them sometime, maybe online. Bloom Energy in California created a service process for some of the ventilators that they were getting from the federal government. I saw it on LinkedIn. I reached out to the people that we knew there. So we copied their process in preparation in case we needed to service and fix any ventilators. Fortunately, we didn't have to do that, but we were looking at all parts of the life cycle for different types of products. I'll click through. So I mentioned we started on March 20th. By April 9th, our first gown manufacturer had a contract for 1 million gowns, 99 degrees in North Andover. This is Merrill Manufacturing in New Bedford. Stephen, I think you said poke the world. I don't know if anybody's had one of these swabs up your nose in the last couple of years, but there was a huge shortage of these, right? And I'm talking very positively about this, and I'll come to a couple comments. This is a very serious situation, but it was also very stressful. But we were air shipping millions of swabs from Italy because there's 2 global manufacturers for swabs, and these are class 1 medical exempt FDA device, very simple. But one manufacturer was in Italy that got hit before us. The other one was in Maine. They're having a patent dispute during all of this. So we started working with a national 3D printing consortium of some of the biggest industrial 3D printing companies. And within 6 weeks, we worked with all of them to design, clinically validate, and talk to the FDA about usage of these swabs as a bridge capacity until actual manufacturing came back. So by mid-May, we had produced 10 million pieces of PPE and over 1.5 million swabs. I think by that fall, we were up to 15 million items of PPE. For comparison, FEMA Region 1, which is the New England region, had distributed 20 million items of PPE. So we were sort of on par with what the federal government was providing to the region, and tens of millions of 3D printed swabs. On top of that, we set up, as we talk about that full life cycle process, testing capabilities so that not only could we help the manufacturers reduce the uncertainty of the types of things that they were designing and building the concepts before we got to FDA submission, but we were also helping state emergency management agency test the masks that they had in stockpile or that they were bringing in internationally so that we could understand the efficacy before they distributed them. Ollie, this one's for you. You did a graph network seminar on during IAP, and I will tell you this is like a hobby of mine, but this was inside my head during all of this. These are the different types of projects, companies responding in different ways in Massachusetts, which includes a lot from MIT during this time, I think there's a link on our website to click through this, but this is also organized as a 2-by-using structure. I think Ed's gone, so I'm trying to do the bingo thing, right, and call on everybody. So there's the link if you want to click through that. Some of the outcomes of this is we got an NSF grant to study what we did. We got an Economic Development Administration grant to help strengthen the relationships that were made and look at how can we respond to crises in the future. Critical supply chain of what we're going through right now is actually in the realm of that. AFOA was one of the Manufacturing USA institutes that's here in Cambridge that we worked with. They just got an $11 million grant to continue to look at national production of PPE. And I think that was all 4 of those. And Donna, I hope you're still doing work with MXD, which was another outcome from this, from the relationships. Tom, I think you mentioned sort of where SDM fits and LGO. Through my experience, figuring out where am I and who am I working with, this was through John Hart trying to map out what's the view of manufacturing today at MIT. And I think he and some other folks at Course 2 are trying to figure out how did some of these maybe knit together a little bit differently. This may not be 100% accurate, so asterisk there. I'm going to click through this really quickly. So that was the MERT. I did go on to also co-chair another group with a terrible acronym called MATSI, Massachusetts Testing, Tracing, and Supported Isolation, which was with a woman named Danielle Allen from the Harvard Software Center for Ethics. And she was working very closely with Ashish Jha, who was heading up the Harvard Global Health Institute at the time. He's now at the Dean of the School of Public Health at Brown and was just named the czar, the next COVID czar by President Biden. This work was shifting to more public health as a system. They have a lot of very similar thinking, but this was where leveraging a lot of the SDM sort of language, architecting, structure in terms of process or design, really being comprehensive about all of the things that you need to actually complete some of these critical functions. And I apologize, I should have mentioned at the beginning, there's hour-long webinars for both the MERT and MATSI on the SDM YouTube site that I did last February. So if you're interested in this area, I just want to be cognizant of some of the time here. But really looking at, how do you think of this public health response as a system? We had just finished that cross-national nasopharyngeal swab project. We'd worked with another one on viral transport media so that Beth Israel could actually have test kits sent out to their employees. But how do you operationalize some of the things that this other group were looking at? And a lot of that was being done here on campus, other academic universities. And so this group tried to pull together some of those groups to share best practices and think about the interdependencies of some of these. Test turnaround time is something that I got to learn a lot about at the Broad Institute during my thesis as it relates to genomics sequencing. So this is a very similar sort of layout process to that. This is just PCR-based testing or rapid antigen. This one's for Bruce. Morphological matrix of different multi-layered testing modalities. UMass Amherst is actually one of the, I'd say, furthest advanced universities in terms of deploying wastewater surveillance at 40 different buildings on campus, where they can then dynamically surge PCR testing or use Salesforce to email students to say, go to the vending machine that we have in your building. There's test kits available for you there. And some of that comes from how do you think about the different values that different types of testing and monitoring are working. Peter Reinhardt from UMass Amherst is on this group, and we work pretty closely with him. And then some of our work, this doesn't come from from me as some of the work that we were doing all together, but Danielle Allen and Ashish Jha had really high connections in terms of government and other places. And so some of this has been incorporated into the Biden administration's first COVID plan when he came into office, as well as some of the ARPA ways in which ARPA dollars are being utilized in Massachusetts and other states. But again, to me, it's about the people. So these are some of the folks from the MATSI team that I got to meet. We got together for a dinner last July. You can see Dr. Mark Zidell there in much better spirits. And then the team at Beth Israel just received a $900,000 grant to study real world evidence of PCR tests and rapid antigen tests. So there's these sort of, again, it's the relationships and the people, and I think this is some of what's continuing to carry forward. As Joan mentioned, I was quite surprised to be the recipient of the Collier Medal. I did bring this today because I just want to say it's as much for me as everybody here. SDM has meant a lot to me. And I don't think I would have been, one, able to do that, or two, had the time to do it without the support of Joan and Brian. So thank you guys very much. This is I won't go through this. This is too much right now, but this is my current mental model of my job. But if anybody here is working in any of the emerging technologies across the top or workforce across the bottom in the state of Massachusetts and interested in talking about how we as Mass Tech and the state do economic development in all these areas that we're all interested in, I'd love to chat with you. We are hiring, but I'll stop rambling there. Thank you all.
Then we can take a couple questions if there's people that are interested in hearing a little bit more or have questions from Ben's work. And I think most impactfully is how he's used systems as part of all of the pieces that he's done as he's worked on pandemic response. But if there's any questions, and if not, I think you're going to be here afterwards and can answer questions after.
Yeah, and I forgot I added a conclusion slide about 30 minutes ago. But I think for me, one of the really big takeaways in this is that we talk a lot about sort of these relationships and these connections. And I think a really big component of this to me is really having to think about this as human connected. We hear human centered a lot, which I think there's a time and a place for that. But I think with the situation that we are in, it's really about multiple people, multiple perspectives, multiple stakeholders, and those connections to technology, manufacturing, but also the community connection. And that's an area that if people have thoughts in terms of your community, how you've seen people come together, some of our work with the state is thinking about how we continue to support recovery. And there's a really tough architectural challenge of how are communities architected, how are people's individualities architected, and where are those intersections. So there's a lot of work left to do. I think cohesive collaboration is really, really important. And for me, again, it's go out for adventure and come home for love. And I think for me, SDM is one of my homes.
Ollie, I think had a comment.
Yeah.
Incredibly impressed with what you've done during the pandemic. All those, the manufacturing that was stood up, these processes that you showed. How much of those processes do you think are going to continue? How many of them are just going to go away because they were just for the pandemic? In other words, how do we design systems that can be so put asleep and then when you need them, they're right there?
Yeah, and I'd say.
Sorry, just for the people online, do you mind just doing a quick recap of the question?
Yeah, so the question from Ollie was, how do we, or one, how many of these types of manufacturers and processes are maybe still going? And then two, how does maybe the demand change and the crisis timing of this, how do we think about that in terms of being able to respond in the future and not having to rebuild all of this? So the first one is there's probably a handful of those companies that are still producing. Some of them have gotten Defense Logistic Agency contracts from the federal government to fulfill stockpile orders. But it's not that all of them were able to. Some of them, again, the problem originally was, I would say most everyone was responding altruistically. We just need to get our neighbors stuff to keep them safe. But there was a point where people who maybe thought med device was going to be harder to get into as a business said, maybe this is something we should be doing as an alternative market. And that's proven challenging for a couple reasons. The healthcare system and marketplace has a lot of complexity. The demand response has changed quite dramatically at different times of the pandemic. Global market or global suppliers kind of went dormant and have come back depending on the surges that they've had. And so we focused a lot on the supply. So there's still a little bit going on there, but on the demand side of things, I think there's some alternative models that we could look at, especially in crisis, of how do we think about, in the healthcare system coming out of my background, there's group purchasing organizations. So how do we think about group purchasing for small, in this case, small health centers or municipalities, right, where we can get a little bit more economies of scale and buying power. But there's, anywhere from how do we subsidize some of this? How do we think about flexible manufacturing options? Digital twins comes up in a lot of how do we visualize and understand what's there. And so it's a lot of work left to go on there, but good question.
I think we're going to stop it there just so that we can move on. But please, if you've got questions for Ben afterwards, please. It was an absolute pleasure to work with you throughout this process and just see how fast we think about those timelines, and we think about how scared a lot of us were about PPE and things like that. And the timelines of 4 weeks and 6 weeks to getting product in people's hands was absolutely amazing. So thank you.